Cynicism is just another form of cowardice. For our sergeant are not interested in a midlife crisis. We were to do our freaking work.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 22 of the Spotlight Podcast, Success Stories for Veterans, where it is our job to break down and analyze titans from both the military and civilian communities to discover their tactics, their mindset, and their systems so that you can take those and apply them to your life and ultimately to your transition. Those titans range from New York Times bestselling authors to former heads of state to other divergent thinkers who are out there dominating their field by challenging conventional wisdom. And one of the ultimate divergent thinkers that I have come across recently is the person we are interviewing today, Richard Tedeschi. Now, Richard is a pioneer of this concept known as post-traumatic growth. And I first became familiar with his work when a friend of mine handed me an article that he wrote, and I've been following his work ever since. He co-wrote the book, the Post-Traumatic Growth Workbook, and Transformed by Trauma. So what is the difference between something like post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic growth? This is something that you need to listen to. Find out.
I became interested in trauma by asking a question about what makes people wise. And my colleague at UNC Charlotte, University of North Carolina, Charlotte, Lawrence Calhoun, and I started interviewing people who had suffered severe traumas in adulthood. And through those interviews, we started to hear stories where people had described changes in their lives that were for the better after these events, struggling through these events, trying to come to terms with them, and the new situations in their lives had produced some changes that they really valued. So this led us on a bit of a search through the literature to find other examples of these kinds of things, and led us to develop some research strategies so that we could learn more about the process of this phenomenon. And we came to coin the term post-traumatic growth to describe what we were hearing from people. And post-traumatic growth is the changes that people report in the aftermath of the struggle that they have with traumatic events in their life. In the mid-2000s, I ended up doing some work for the Army out at Tripler Army Medical Center and training staff out there. And that began some association I've had ever since with the military. Most recently, I'm with Boulder Crest Retreat in Bluemont, Virginia, and Sonoyta, Arizona. And in Bluemont, we have the Boulder Crest Institute for Post-Traumatic Growth, where we develop programs for veterans and first responders to help people move from post-traumatic stress disorder and other kinds of struggles toward a life of growth. So that's been my most recent contact with veterans. It's through Boulder Crest.
Gotcha. And for the veteran population, because post-traumatic stress disorder, and you mentioned it very briefly, is something that gets discussed a lot. Can you contrast post-traumatic growth against post-traumatic stress, or how do they interact?
Well, it's interesting that they both arise from trauma. The seeds of post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic growth start in the same place with traumatic events. Post-traumatic stress disorder is defined by a lot of symptoms that people report. Things like hypervigilance and startle responses and nightmares and avoidance strategies and all these kinds of things. And those are quite natural responses to abnormal situations, things that are overwhelming our natural system of self-protection and self-defense. But post-traumatic growth, what happens with that is that in the aftermath of these traumatic events, we not only have symptoms, but what really constitutes trauma from the perspective of post-traumatic growth is the challenge to core beliefs that happen because of the trauma that people experience. So we all have a kind of a set of assumptions we make about our lives and the kind of people we are, the kind of world we live in, kind of unquestioned ideas and beliefs. And traumatic events tend to disrupt these systems of belief and make us ask questions about, what kind of sense we should make of things now. And in that process of asking those questions and trying to figure out and reconstruct our belief systems, there's a possibility for growth. So people can experience post-traumatic stress disorder while also be on a journey towards post-traumatic growth at the same time, because they both come out of trauma. In one sense, trauma produces symptoms. In another sense, trauma can disrupt basic beliefs, right, which set in motion this whole process that can produce growth in the longer term.
And from your perspective, is there a way that the people who are experiencing this trauma afterwards can move away more towards one against the other? Or is it something that just has to be experienced in its totality? What's your perspective on that?
Well, in order to move towards post-traumatic growth, there are some things that people can do. First of all, you do have to get some kind of handle on the most distracting and debilitating aspects of the symptoms that you suffer. So people should be able to find some ways to regulate their emotions in the aftermath of trauma. Basically, calm down the system of alarm that's been so frequently set off in the aftermath of these events. So trying to get a way to calm oneself is important in this, so that you can think straight, so that you can kind of engage in a process of reflection on what has happened to you, instead of just reacting to it out of anxiety. So that's one important part of it. And then another important part of it is to have someone to talk to have a good listener. What Lawrence Calhoun and I have described as an expert companion. And at Boulder Crest, we call them expert guides. People who can show some patience and understanding of your situation and willing to hear you out, so that through your discussions with them, you come to develop a better understanding of what you're going through and where you're headed. So being able to calm yourself and to find someone with whom you can articulate what you're going through and explain it, and be able to work with it to make sense of what's happening to you. Those are two very important things: the calming and the talking.
For somebody who finds themselves in that situation, maybe they have identified like, hey, I'm not regulating my emotions well, but I don't know how to switch it up. I don't know what to do differently because I'm here and this is new to me. What do you recommend that someone who's going through that do in those types of situations to regulate those emotions?
Yeah. Well, there are a number of practices that you can start to engage in depending on what's comfortable for you. Some people like physical activity in order to regulate those emotions, taking the energy that comes from anxiety perhaps and channeling it somewhere into some kind of constructive activity. And that could be just physical workouts. That could be some activity where you're doing something and constructing something. I don't know, woodworking, landscaping, whatever it is, getting outside.
Yeah.
Riding your bike. I don't know. So just doing something physical with them is one way. And then the other way that I think is important is through meditative experiences. So at Boulder Crest, we really emphasize meditation as a good way to try to regulate some of these emotions. And some people think that meditation would be kind of an odd thing to do or weird in some way, or you know, your work with the Zen veteran tells me that you probably don't think that way, and
No.
you see this as very important.
I'm bought in for sure.
Yep. So we really find that people who come through our program and are taught meditation often cite that as one of the most important factors. One of the most important factors in their growth afterwards. Learning that through, and you could start with a simple app, phone app, just to kind of introduce yourself to it. And there's some good books out there on meditation that are pretty practical, and then there are, of course, meditation teachers you can go to. So there's different ways to learn it. And it's not odd. It's a very natural kind of experience. So physical activity and meditation are two of the best ways to start to learn to regulate your emotions.
Outstanding. So I'd like to come back to meditation in a moment. First, I wanted to follow up as far as someone to talk to is one of the two steps in something that people can do is having that expert guide. It's something that you mentioned. Is there a right expert or a wrong expert to listen to? Will anybody do? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when we talk about the expert, we're talking about someone who doesn't necessarily have professional expertise, but what they're expert in is being a companion, being a listener, being understanding. That's the expertise we're emphasizing here. Not necessarily expertise about trauma, but expertise in being a companion to you, someone that you're comfortable with, someone you see as trustworthy, and someone who'll just give you the time to talk and explore and be patient with you as you're going through things. So it's that kind of expertise. So I think people know them when they find them.
Yeah.
And that could be your brother. It could be somebody from your combat unit. It could be someone at the VFW. It could be your next door neighbor. It could be a psychotherapist. It could be your clergy person. I mean, it could be anybody. It could be a guy at work. I mean, it could be your spouse. So it's just a person who has that way of being with you, being present and comfortable with you, so that you can say what's on your mind without having to worry about being judged, without having to worry about that they'll think something about you and want to escape from you because you're so strange or screwed up or whatever. Someone will hang in there with you.
Do you have any examples of experts that you've seen either in your work that maybe you wouldn't have thought on the surface, hey, this person's going to do a great job with people who are struggling with trauma, but here they are, and they do it time and time again, but they're not necessarily pro. Do you have an example of that?
Well, the expert guides we have at Boulder Crest are all veterans. And they're not, they don't have degrees in psychology or social work or something like that, but they've been through this themselves. And there's some people who just have this way about them. They have a degree of warmth. They have a degree of patience. And they're not egotistical. They don't think they have all the answers. They're not going to be just advice givers. So it's that kind of person. And some of the veterans that we've brought on our staff to serve in these positions are just really remarkable in the way that they have learn to connect. There's some people just naturally have that, and you give them a few tools to work with, and you've got something special going on there. So it's that kind of person, and you find people like that in all kinds of places.
Yeah, I agree.
And people go through trauma and grief and loss and all that. What they often find, what I've heard over and over again, is that some of the people they thought would be the best companions for them through this fail them, and some people they never thought would be important or be able to help turn out to be the ones that are best. It kind of flips their. It's like they changed their address book, and it's all flipped around. It's just so interesting how I've heard that story so frequently from people.
Yeah, mine was very similar. I found mine through mountain biking, and mountain biking buddies like, oh, here's this new group of people that makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So let's jump back to meditation. So we found our experts. We've got those people, but we're struggling with meditation. And I think meditation for a lot of people is just a big ocean to jump into. And there's a lot of noise surrounding meditation as far as what it could be. Everybody has their opinion. Some people hate this type, some people hate that type. What are your thoughts on meditation?
Well, I'm not an expert on meditation. I mean, I learned meditation back in the mid 70s, basically. Believe it or not, it's kind of when meditation first came to the United States, I guess. But I'm not an expert in it, and so I guess what I emphasize to people is you've got to find your pathway to it that's comfortable for you, and I think there are some kind of stereotypes about meditation out there, and ideas about how odd it would be, or the people that teach it are strange, or something like that. So if you're afraid that might be the case, you're going to have to find a way to get to it that's comfortable for you. And like I mentioned to you, you go to apps like Headspace or Calm or something like that, and just try those things out. Little 3-minute, 5-minute meditations or whatever. Just and mostly, what's important is to recognize that in a lot of circumstances in life, you're already meditating. You have meditative experiences a lot, and what they often involve is being in the flow and really present in your activity. You could be taking a walk. You could be just sitting and look at the trees in your yard, and you start to get into almost a trance-like state because you're so present in noticing things. So being really mindful of what you're doing and being involved and engaged in what you're doing can be like a meditative experience. You could be playing a musical instrument. You could be painting a picture. You could be doing woodworking. You could be, mowing your lawn. I mean, you can be doing anything and find yourself in a kind of a calm, present state where other things are kind of way off on the periphery now. And you're undistracted by all of that and focused instead on being or doing what you're involved in the moment. So I think it's important to recognize that meditative states are in some ways not special. They're common. And so you don't have to learn meditation so much. It's sometimes more of recognizing the kinds of times and places where that actually happens to you. I think many of us have had the experience, for example, of driving somewhere, and we drive some fairly long distance, and we arrive at our destination and we realize, I don't really remember how I got here exactly or what happened along the way, but somehow I got the car here. Now, how did that happen? Mm-hmm. It's almost like a trance-like state or a meditative state, and you're driving.
And you won 50 arguments with nobody along the way, and you're like, oh, this was a great day.
That's right. Yes, right. So So, I mean, that's kind of, I think that's a way to think about what the experience is like. And some people need just some help in entering it.
Yeah.
And so there's some techniques for entering it and then making it something that you regularly enter into in your life, so that when you practice entering into these states regularly, you kind of retrain your brain to be able to be calm and focused. You give it that practice of being calm and focused every day. And in doing so, you develop another way of living through your life, especially when things get tough and things get anxiety arousing. You have a place to go to that offsets all of that stress and anxiety.
I think it's a very interesting distinction that you referred more to experiences, and I think a lot of people, when you were talking about stereotypes of meditation, think that it's just sitting in a room and being quiet. Is is that what you've seen as well?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's a useful way to meditate, and we teach that. But I think it's important to recognize that that's not the only time that you can be experiencing those kinds of states. And for some people, um, you know, doing things um, produce that same kind of experience
Yeah.
of focused attention, um, undistracted attention, and it's a relief to be
Yeah.
in that state of mind.
Yeah. And you, when I gave you these questions beforehand, and one thing that veterans are running into is they're very find themselves even being anxious about, like, what step to take, because there was always a step, right? There was always like the OSME Act, the 5-paragraph order or something along those lines. And what was interesting when I gave you those questions, hey, about how do you know when it's time to switch something up or when it's time to be more disciplined about something you're already doing. You told me, it's really about gathering data to make those decisions. How do you recommend somebody who's maybe in just the regular day-to-day world gather data so that they can track their progress, or they can understand what the next move is?
Mm. Well, you're going to get data from, maybe to be simplistic about this, you can get data from two sources: yourself and your own experience, and then what other people are seeing about you. So, um, other people may be giving you some feedback that you're on the wrong track, or that you seem to be upset lately, or you're difficult to live with, or something. um, and I think you need to pay attention, because sometimes it's about them, but it may be about you, especially if you hear this from more than one person.
Yeah.
So there's some data for you to pay attention to. And then the other is, what's your inner life telling you? In your gut, are you satisfied with what's going on? Or is your gut telling you, this sucks, and this is not the way I want to be, and this is not the way I want to live, and I'm unhappy with it? Or I mean, you got to pay attention to, you got to have some awareness of what's going on inside you. These messages to yourself that something's up, something may be wrong, and that's sometimes the kind of data that people suppress. They suppress it by drinking too much and smoking too much pot, and we're getting into some other kinds of activities that distract them from a truth about their lives that they're just not willing to acknowledge, because at some level they realize, oh, if I acknowledge this, that means I'm going to have to maybe do something about it, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to. I'm not sure I want to disrupt things or take on that challenge, or it's scary or risky. So I don't want to go. I don't want to do it. So I'm just going to try not to pay attention to these messages from inside.
And for what I see, a lot of veterans, the data point they seem to be giving me, and this is anecdotal, I've had a lot of conversations with veterans over the year, when they get to that truth-seeking moment, and what they're saying is, I'm not satisfied because I don't have a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you go from there? Because they're trying to digest this whole concept of my purpose, and it's like they're trying to eat an elephant. What's the next step from that point?
Yeah. I hear what you're saying there, and that it's, first of all, you can't give somebody a purpose, right? So no one's going to give them the purpose, and you're not going to be able to do it. So
certainly
put that aside. A purpose is something that people have to create. They have to decide what that's going to be, and so it's something that, as you said, you can't eat the elephant. You're going to have to approach this and be patient with yourself, and involve yourself in this creative process. And I think that in our work in post-traumatic growth, especially at Boulder Crest, one of the things that we try to do to encourage people on a path towards that is to figure out some ways to be of service, and to define some kind of mission for yourself. And that doesn't have to be something grand or a huge challenge, but it should be something where somebody else benefits from being around you, or something that you do. So try to figure out some way that you can be of benefit to other people, even in the smallest way. So you could start with saying something kind to the cashier at the convenience store. I mean, you could say, I'm going to be the guy who goes to the convenience store, and every time I go there, I'm going to say something nice to the cashier, and they're going to think, oh, that's a good, nice guy. That brightens my day a little bit. So, maybe you start there.
Yeah.
Just do something where other people are benefiting from your presence, and start building on that. And where that goes, who knows? But just start with that kind of thinking. And also, as a military person, you can start to think in terms of mission, because as a military person, it's always about the mission. Training for the mission, preparing for the mission, or performing the mission, or having your after action review, or just, it's all about the mission. And you have no purpose as a military person if there's no mission. So you got to figure that out now that you're maybe outside of the military, in the civilian world. How to define missions, or to join others in a mission that you believe in. So that's another way towards a sense of purpose.
Mm. Are there some questions that, if I'm in that situation, that I can ask myself to help start teasing that out?
Well, certainly. You can ask yourself what your skills and talents and experiences are. What you got to offer, what's special about you. Now, of course, some people can first come to the conclusion that there's nothing special about me. I got nothing. Yeah. I think you have to look a little deeper. For example, one of the things you might want to do is look back in your life toward the things that maybe left behind, that were interests or skills or abilities that maybe you used to practice or wanted to develop, and you kind of left them behind somewhere, and they haven't been around in a while in your life. So rediscover some of those kinds of things. So that's one thing. Another thing is to recognize that the simple fact of who you are and that you're a human being and you have certain capabilities as a human being, ordinary human capabilities. That's extraordinary enough. The fact that you're someone who can listen to somebody else. You can spend some time with somebody else. You can throw a kid a ball. There's just there's just some real basic things that you can do that can turn into something very important in the world of the people around you.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think people underestimate themselves and are blind to what they have to offer. And so I think people just have to have, again, more awareness of who they are, what they experienced, what they know, what they've done in the past, what interests they have, and therefore what they have to share around all of this stuff.
And speaking of sharing, one thing that a lot of vets who are out there, especially ambitious vets, maybe they've started to get on the right track or they've started to kind of gain some momentum and they're struggling with the concept of how do I help my friends who I see, maybe are struggling as well? How do I approach that conversation, whether it's to be an expert guide or just to, get somebody else pointed in the right direction? What's your advice to those people?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a couple of things that I would say. One is just being around them, doing what you're doing, and coming back to them and not leaving them alone is just important in itself. So being yourself, going about your business in life, and being in touch with them is important. I've heard vets say to me that they've been down in the doldrums, they've been drinking too much, or they've just been laying in their bed or something like that, and they have friends who've shown up and just refused to go away. Just keep coming back. They just refuse to let them alone. They don't give up on them. They don't leave them behind. They do not leave them behind. They don't give up on them. They just keep coming back. And eventually, the guy said, I said, well, okay, I'll go with you. I'll do that. We'll go fishing or whatever it's going to be. Yeah. And it started a process. So just hanging out and being there and being persistent is a big part of it. And of course, sometimes it's hard because you might be dealing with someone who is really frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Really frustrating.
Yeah.
So you have to decide, are you going to be one of those people who just sticks around for a while and leaves or what? And that doesn't mean you're going to have to go by there every day. Or that doesn't mean that you have to have high expectations. You just show people that, there's another step they can take. There's another little experience they can have. So that's one thing. And then
go ahead.
The second thing in terms of helping people who you want to help is invite them to get involved in something that you might be doing, to just kind of give them a taste and to have them see that what it is that you're doing, why it speaks to you, or why this gives you some satisfaction or fulfillment. Do something together like that. And the important thing isn't that they do exactly what you're doing, but then they just get a sense of, mm-hmm. I can enjoy myself, or I can be uplifted, or I can do something. There's something else out there besides what I've been doing so far. So just give them a taste.
And along giving people a taste, are there any type of books or resources that you recommend whether it's people who are coming to you regarding themselves having post-traumatic or a traumatic situation, or it's somebody who has a friend? What resources do you recommend they dig into?
Well, I guess I'm going to have to sell something here.
That's fine.
We at Boulder Crest, we've just completed a book called Transformed by Trauma. And what that book is, it's stories of post-traumatic growth. What we did was we interviewed military service members, family members of those people who've gone through really tough things, who've been wounded, who've been sexually assaulted, who's had friends or family members die, commit suicide. People have been through all these kinds of things. And we've interviewed them, and we have parts of these interviews in the book where they kind of explain how they got through this process from being just down in the dumps to growth. So in their own words and with our commentary, we kind of lay out what that process looks like. So we find that that's a book that we want people to read, especially military people, but not exclusively. But that provides kind of a sort of a pathway and a way to understand this process, and how you can follow some examples of some people who have turned their lives in really useful directions after having been in terrible circumstances. So that's one thing. And then we have Brett Moore and Brett is a psychologist down at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, veteran himself, Bronze Star guy. He and I wrote a workbook on post-traumatic growth, which kind of gives people a kind of step-by-step process to go through these phases of growth. And so that can be useful. But I think there are also some other books that I think are really good ones could speak to a veteran. So one we like is a book called Stories from the Hanoi Hilton. And it's the stories of prisoners of war in the Vietnam era in Hanoi, and kind of how they made it through, their confinement for so many years in that prisoner of war camp, and what they learned from it, and how they continued to develop into the people they are as a result of that. And then another book that we like is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which is kind of a classic book of this psychiatrist who was in a concentration camp in World War II and sort of studied, how can people survive these kinds of circumstances and still find life worth living after going through such horror. So, those are some resources, and on our Boulder Crest website at bouldercrest.org, we have videos and all kinds of information there for people to look at. So there are ways to start to educate yourself about this kind of process of moving towards growth in the aftermath of the terrible circumstances you might find yourself in.
Yeah, I know you're a busy man, Richard. So we got one more question for you before you walk away. And if you could talk to all the ambitious veterans of whether it's the United States or around the world, and impart one piece of advice to them, what would you leave them with?
Well, I think it's important to recognize what you have to offer. Don't underestimate yourself, and recognize that you are an important person in this world to somebody or some people, and you don't have to aspire to creating something grand or somehow attracting a lot of attention to yourself in this process. The people who quietly go about being forces for good in the world are our most important people. So I would say that it's important to recognize that in oneself, what you have to offer, just through your own contacts with people and interactions with people, and just make the most of those every time you have an opportunity. So I guess that's one thing I'd like people to keep in mind.
Right. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. This was fantastic. And it's been great.
Well, I thank you for your questions and helping me talk through some of this, and I hope people can put it to good use.
Hey everyone, thanks again for listening to another episode of the Spotlight Podcast. And I just wanted to take a second to ask you who you think should be interviewed on the show. Who do you think is out there that's just absolutely crushing it that the veteran population needs to hear from? That's what we want to hear from you. Send us your suggestions to spotlight@thezenveteran.com. That's SPOTLIGHT @thezenveteran.com. Thanks again for listening.